What on earth is going on in this country? I mean, is there anything that's running properly or well? I mean, last night was bad enough when we knew what was going to happen. We knew that Keir Starmer would call the three-line whip on his MPs and disgracefully refuse point blank to have any kind of investigation. We were saying yesterday they need to have some kind of investigation. If they want to go down the road of saying there's no point in having an inquiry, we've already had one, they still need to do something, don't they?
No, absolutely. And I think it was absolutely shameful and horrendous the way in which they handled all of this. I mean, we had last night, as part of this kind of suggestion that they might change tack at some point, Jess Phillips saying, well, if the survivors want an inquiry, then we'll have one. The survivors have already called for an inquiry. Yes. That's what sparked all of this in the first place, that and Oldham Council asking for one. So it just looks, regardless of what else they want to say about this, it just looks as if they're tin-eared to these concerns and would rather just kind of carry on as they were rather than look at the specific issue here, because as we all know, this hasn't been dealt with, either in terms of justice in the past or actually making sure these gangs aren't continuing to operate in the present. Well,
they can't simply say, well, we've done an inquiry already, because the previous inquiry, as we said yesterday and the day before, the J inquiry, did not really focus on grooming gangs. It focused on child abuse in general, and I think out of something like several years of taking evidence, 2 weeks of evidence was taken on grooming gangs. Maggie Oliver made a statement with 2/3 of which was cut out. You know, Rotherham was mentioned once, Telford wasn't mentioned at all, you know. So there was no, you can't really say that they've done an investigation and a proper report on grooming gangs, because they haven't.
No, absolutely. I think the Labour Party and a lot of people in the kind of liberal great and good, they try to generalise this issue. They try and talk about grooming gangs, the rape gangs in the kind of context of sexual violence and paedophilia more broadly.
Because everybody's at it, effectively.
Yeah, and because it dilutes the controversy. The issue in the first place was the fact that, of course, there are going to be commonalities in terms of how these cases are treated. The specific thing here was because the perpetrators tend to be Pakistani Muslim, and some would argue because the victims tended to be white working class and poor girls who were not treated seriously by the police, that there was a specific issue of a blind spot, of cover-up, of sensitivities creeping in and so on. So to try and generalise it, as Labour likes to do, is a way of ignoring it.
Yeah, exactly is. And on the front page of the Times today, a story by Tom Witherow, a definition of Islamophobia adopted by the Labour Party put the phrase grooming gangs in inverted commas and suggested that using the term in relation to a Muslim was in fact racist, which tells you everything you need to know. The wording was established in a report by a group co-chaired by Wes Streeting, now the Health Secretary, obviously, and this is since March 2019. Labour adopted the definition and examples in a report which included a warning that Asian grooming gangs are a modern iteration of age-old stereotypes. The document listed those as sexual profligacy and paedophilia, or Islam and violence, concluding that they put Muslims at risk of hate crimes. So basically they've said, this is why we don't want to talk about grooming gangs, and that's now there in black and white Labour Party policy.
Absolutely, it's unbelievable, this. I mean, they're effectively saying that to talk about grooming gangs is racist. That is what got us into this mess in the first place, and this is obviously this all-party...
And how can they not see that?
I think it's one of those things where a lot of the times they sleepwalk into these things. This was part of the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims. They came up with this definition of Islamophobia. They were suggesting that the government take it on board. It became very controversial. Labour just adopts it wholesale under Jeremy Corbyn without necessarily even thinking about it, and it leads them into a situation like this, where on the one hand they're saying we take grooming gangs seriously, on the other hand they're using a definition in their own policies that says to talk about it is racist. It's ridiculous.
I mean, and also looking back at what happened over the years, basically, Anne Cryer, the former Labour MP who raised concerns initially about white girls being attacked and raped by British Pakistani men, she was shouted down as a racist in various meetings that she held with Labour. Claims of racism were also levelled at in 2011, and also Sarah Champion, Labour MP who spoke up for Victor Rotherham. She was nominated for a charity's Islamophobe of the Year award in 2018. I mean, it beggars belief how the left has kind of completely not only ignored the problem, but actually demonised those people who were trying to point out that there was something going on.
No, absolutely, and that's why it's so galling to see so many people pretend that they always cared about this issue in the first place. Up until, you know, Sarah Champion was in Jeremy Corbyn's front bench. She was sacked because she spoke out about this particular issue. This was very recently that you had various people in writing newspaper columns and chattering about this in the media who treated anyone who talked about this issue plainly as basically a far-right individual. So for them to pretend
and clearly
that they care about
that's
it now...
what Keir Starmer still believes, because he said it only the other day, didn't he? That if you want to have an inquiry effectively, you are being sort of, at the very least, sympathetic to the far right. This is nonsensical.
It's absolutely nonsensical. It's outrageous. It's a real kind of libel against the people that he's aiming at, but also the victims who are being told that their own experience is basically a far-right trope and not real, in effect. And it's been incredible to watch them obsess over the way in which people are talking about this particular issue, who might be jumping on the bandwagon and whatever, rather than the issue itself. Yeah. But that's been how they've handled this whole crisis.
Right. Let's have a look at some clips from yesterday. Kemi Badenoch was speaking before the vote last night about grooming gangs.
Let us have the truth. The Prime Minister cannot tell the House the full scale of the scandal. He doesn't want questions asked of Labour politicians who may be complicit. He won't listen to the victims. He won't listen to the victims who are calling for a national inquiry. He is making this all about a bill this afternoon. Later today, he will tell Labour MPs, including in Telford, Rochdale, Bristol, Derby, Aylesbury, Oldham, Bradford, Peterborough, Coventry, Middlesbrough, Newcastle, Ramsgate, to tell all of these people to vote against a national inquiry into the gangs which have systematically gang raped children in their constituencies. This is one of the worst scandals in British history, Mr. Speaker.
And she's absolutely right. And interesting to watch Angela Rayner sitting there shaking her head, and, you know, she's been incredibly quiet about all of this. She has not said one word about Asian grooming gangs. She has not said one word about Pakistani men in her constituency, some of whom have been prosecuted and sent to jail for being involved in this kind of activity. She has not uttered a word on Twitter. Do you know, on social media, she hasn't said anything for 2 days, and that was a retweet of Keir Starmer saying, "My government is fighting for change." It's interesting. The biggest story of the week, of the month, practically, maybe of the year, Angela Rayner's got nothing to say, even though her constituency is involved.
It's incredible. I mean, this is a Labour Party that was demanding inquiries when Boris Johnson ate a bit of cake.
Yes.
And yet,
they've called for 10 different inquiries, by the way, in the last 4 or 5 years.
You know, they've usually called for about 4 or 5 inquiries before breakfast.
Yes.
I mean, and now on this is one of the greatest. It's horrendous. And also, and Kemi Badenoch raised this point, you can't help but think that a certain incentive behind them not wanting to get behind this inquiry is the fact that a lot of these councils were Labour-run.
Of course they were.
And, of course, there's going to be a lot of questions asked about why this happened under their watch, and whilst it might not be politics in the front benches or even the back benches, it's going to raise questions more generally, and you can't help but feel that that's part of the mix here without wanting to sound cynical or conspiratorial.
There's absolutely no question that they don't want to go anywhere near this story. Keir Starmer's doing his level best to make it go away and to hope that it will go away. Can't stand the fact that Elon Musk is basically, you know, stoking the fires and the flames every single day. And thank goodness that he is, because if it wasn't for Elon Musk, we wouldn't even be talking about it.
And also, if Keir Starmer had any sense, and if he really did have people around him who are willing to upset the left where necessary, as is often talked about Morgan McSweeney and whatnot, you know, there would have been space for him to try and make an argument to say, you know, I was DPP, I did change the rules and the guidelines around sentencing.
Very latterly.
Very latterly, but nevertheless, he could try and construct an argument. The Tories didn't touch this for 14 years. Now is the point that we're really going to take this issue seriously. We're listening to the victims. The fact they didn't even try to do that rhetorically tells you how radioactive they see this topic still, even after all these years, all these investigations. The fact that it's been brought out into the light so many times, they still cannot digest this story, and that's one of the biggest problems.
They can't get their heads around how to deal with it because they're so frightened, and that to me is appalling, really, when you consider what they're supposed to be able to do running the country, but yet they can't face up to a relatively small collection of individuals in communities that they fear. And I don't know why they fear them, because in the end, surely the Labour government can exist without the Muslim vote. They don't have to pay pandering to individual kind of small, relatively minor groups of people in this country, do they? But I mean, that seems to be how they believe they have to operate.
But also, what they worried about, you know, losing the child rapist vote. There's something actually quite offensive to the Muslim community in all of this, as if to say, if you take on the grooming gangs too vociferously, that you're going to upset the Muslim community. Is that really your argument? Is that really the anti-racist position?
And if that is the argument, then surely there's something very wrong with those communities.
Yeah, well, and also this is something that, you know, this is a very predominantly Pakistani Muslim. There's all sorts of research which suggests there's a very specific profile. People are working in the nighttime economy, in some cases coming from very specific parts of Pakistan, reportedly. The idea that going after this specific issue and this scourge, which is something which everyone knows is a horrendous problem, including British Muslims, will upset the British Muslim majority, shall we say, is absurd on the face of it, but they're still clinging to it.
Yeah, the British Muslim majority, who they keep referring to as the good people of this country and the people that make Britain great. Oh, really? Well, why are you pandering to people who they supposedly don't like then? Doesn't make any sense. Here's what Dan Hodges says in the Mail today. What will it take before Keir Starmer finally gets it? Or for any of his MPs and ministers who are preparing to dutifully traipse through the lobbies to block a full public inquiry into the rape and abuse of thousands of working class girls? He's basically talking about how Starmer has got this so wrong. He says, I'm starting to wonder whether Starmer has even the most basic understanding of the nation he purports to lead. I was saying this yesterday. He clearly doesn't get Britain, because 95% of people in this country, certainly more or less 100% of the people that listen to this show and watch it, want there to be something done about this. They want there to be some kind of inquiry or investigation or judicial review, something that needs to bring to justice the people who deliberately and quite specifically blocked the prosecution of guilty people.
And the fact that he can't see that is incredible. I think he's really a typical, almost the high point of that kind of haughty Labour politician who really confuses the Guardian comment pages for public opinion, who has no sense of the mood of the country. And I think that's just being demonstrated to people once again, just how, aside from all the other things that are being levelled at them, just cut off from how everyone else is looking at this story and how they're looking at it so wildly different. It's incredible.
Absolutely. And one of the strangest reports that came in from last night, because the list of MPs is now being circulated amongst many of the victims to see who voted for and who voted against this particular amendment. But Keir Starmer apparently abstained, so did some of his senior sort of cabinet colleagues, actually didn't vote at all. No, what's that all about?
I mean, it seems like they just provide themselves with a little bit of cover, but considering the fact that they're requiring the rest of their party, some of which are representing communities that have been hit by this evil, the fact that they were demanding that they vote against this, whereas some of their leading cabinet colleagues were allowed to abstain, is also going to raise questions about who, you know, they're putting them in the firing line, but not everyone else. Two-tier voting.
Yeah, here's the list of people who abstained. Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner, Rachel Reeves, David Lammy, Ed Miliband, Wes Streeting. Interesting.